In Tasmania, the smallest state, there are just over 30,000 people for each federal seat when senators and lower house members elected in the 2016 are combined. That compares with 131,000 people per federal MP in New South Wales and 125,000 in Victoria. Queensland is the only other state with an above-average population to federal seat ratio. South Australia, Northern Territory and Tasmania were all well below the national average. The population per seat in federal parliament varies widely between the states. Photo Nicole Emanuel. Of course, the authors of the Constitution created an electoral skew in order to protect the smaller states. The Constitution stipulates that each original state must have an equal number of senators, regardless of population. The current quota is 12 senators per state and 2 senators for each of the territories. The Constitution also dictates that each state will have 5 members at least in the House of Representatives. Those protections for smaller states were part of the deal that transformed Australia's 6 colonies into a Commonwealth back in 1901, but since then patterns of population growth have been very uneven. In 1901, Tasmania accounted for nearly 5% of the national population. But the latest population estimates, based on last year's national census, show that share has now shrunk to just 2.1%. When Australia's very first census was taken soon after Federation, the most populous state, New South Wales, had 8 times more people than Tasmania. But that multiple has now blown out to 15 times. A population comparison between Victoria and Tasmania since Federation tells a similar story. On current trends, the population gap between Australia's biggest and smallest states will keep growing, making the state-based disparity in voting power even more pronounced. Tasmania will soon be home to less than 1 in 50 Australians, but it will continue to return almost 1 in 6 Australian senators. And Tasmania is not the only state with a shrinking population share. Since Federation, South Australia's proportion of the national population has fallen from almost 10% to just over 7%. NSW's share of national population has also declined from 36% of the national total to about 32% since 1901. But it still has the least favourable federal seat-to-population ratio due to its sheer size. A comparison of the federal representation enjoyed by a Tasmanian voter to that of a voter living in the outer suburbs of Sydney or Melbourne illustrates the arbitrary distribution of national voting power. 2 neighbouring council areas in Sydney's West Blacktown and Fairfield together have a bigger population than the whole of Tasmania. Likewise, in Melbourne's east the neighbouring council areas of Casey, Knox and Greater Dandenong together have a bigger population than Tasmania. But unlike their Tasmanian counterparts, those outer suburban voters in Melbourne and Sydney don't have 12 senators to represent them. The relative size of lower house electorates also contributes to the inferior population to federal seat ratio in large states. Federal seats in the suburbs of Sydney and Melbourne typically have about 110,000 voters. But each Tasmanian electorate only has about 74,000 voters. The difference is due to that constitutional rule giving each state a minimum 5 lower house seats. At the last election, the federal electorate of Canberra in the ACT had over 143,000 voters, almost double the number of electors for the seat of Braddon in northwestern Tasmania. Rawnsley, who is a regional economics expert with consultancy SGS Economics SAMP Planning, predicts that over the next 20 years the New South Wales and Victoria population will continue to grow, but their impact on the federal parliament will continue to weaken. He reckons the rules that gradually reduce the potency of votes in big states are as obsolete as the citizenship provisions in Section 44 of the Constitution that triggered the dual nationality crisis that has embroiled a bevy of MPs including Deputy Prime Minister Barnaby Joyce. Sure, Section 44 is out of date, but maybe first we should look at why a voter in Tasmania has 4.25 times more power than a New South Wales voter, he says. As smaller states have a greater impact on the parliament, you might see regional issues coming into conflict with the national good. But reform would require a constitutional referendum that wins majority support in every state. And voters in smaller states are very unlikely to agree to any change that crimped their political influence. So far, Australia's biggest states have quietly accepted their deteriorating share of federal representation. But over time, the voting disparities driven by demographic change could undermine good policy and put pressure on the Federation. The 2 smallest states already receive a disproportionate share of the GST which the Commonwealth splits between the states. Political tensions are bound to rise if some voters begin to feel they don't have a fair say. Matt Wade is economics writer. Ross Gittins is on leave.